The checkout line at the commissary stretched long that Tuesday morning, filled with the usual collection of dependent spouses, retirees, and off-duty personnel. Captain Marcus, Havoc Chen, stood near the back, his 3-year-old daughter balanced on his hip, her tiny fingers wrapped around a juice box. She hummed something off-key while he shifted the weight of the grocery basket, trying to keep the bread from getting crushed under the canned goods. Nobody looked twice at him. Just another single parent grinding through the weekly shopping, dark circles under his eyes telling the story of sleepless nights and early mornings. The woman ahead of him, wife of some '06 from what her demeanor suggested, kept glancing back with that particular expression that said she had places to be, and his slow-moving line presence offended her schedule. When his daughter dropped the juice box and it rolled toward the woman's designer shoes, she stepped aside with visible distaste, didn't even acknowledge the little girl's whispered apology. Marcus bent down, scooped up the box, kissed his daughter's forehead, and said nothing. He'd been saying nothing for 8 months now, ever since his wife left and the custody papers arrived. The fighter pilot who'd flown combat missions over 3 continents now measured his victories in successfully prepared toddler meals and bedtime stories finished without falling asleep mid-sentence. His flight suit hung in the closet more often than it touched his shoulders. The squadron had been understanding, letting him take the administrative posting, the desk job that kept him groundside and available for daycare pickup. Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked when he'd return to the cockpit. They just assumed Havoc was done, that fatherhood had clipped his wings permanently. The base radio on his belt crackled occasionally with routine traffic, weather updates, pattern work from student pilots making their endless circuits. He'd learned to tune it out, the same way he'd learned to tune out the looks in the squadron-ready room when he left early, the whispers about how the mighty had fallen. His daughter pressed her face against his shoulder, fighting sleep despite the morning hour. She'd been up twice in the night, bad dreams about monsters she couldn't describe. So he'd held her, walked the apartment's narrow hallway, sung songs he barely remembered from his own childhood. Then the radio crackled differently, an edge to the controller's voice that cut through 8 months of domestic autopilot and reached something deeper, something that had been sitting alert and ready even while he'd been playing house. The transmission was clipped, professional, but underneath ran a current of barely controlled urgency that made every pilot in the commissary stop moving. Attention all aircraft. We have an active shooter situation developing at the elementary school on the north end of base. Ground units responding, but suspect is barricaded with possible hostages. The woman ahead of him turned, finally looking at him directly, her face pale. Marcus's mind was already calculating distances, response times, sight lines from altitude. His daughter stirred against his shoulder, sensing the tension in his body. The radio continued, the controller's voice tighter now. Suspect is armed with what appears to be a rifle, positioned in the second-floor classroom, northeast corner of the building. We have confirmation of multiple children inside. All ground approaches are exposed. The commissary had gone completely silent. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, feel the familiar sensation of time stretching and compressing simultaneously, the way it always did before a mission. His phone buzzed. Squadron commander. He answered with his free hand, already knowing what came next. The voice on the other end was clipped. Havoc, I know you're off rotation. I know the situation, but we need eyes on that building, and we need them 5 minutes ago. Every ground approach is a kill zone, and this bastard has fields of fire on the responders. Can you fly? Marcus looked down at his daughter, her brown eyes watching him with that particular 3-year-old intensity that saw more than adults gave credit for. He thought about the juice boxes in his basket, the dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets she loved, the parent-teacher conference scheduled for next week. Then he thought about other parents, other children, trapped in a classroom with a man who'd already decided other people's lives meant less than his grievances. His daughter touched his cheek with her small hand. Daddy. The word was a question and a permission simultaneously. He kissed her forehead, made the decision that would end his 8-month exile from the sky. I can fly, he said into the phone. Where's my wingman? The woman who'd shown such distaste 5 minutes earlier stepped forward, her expression completely transformed. Her voice was steady, surprising him. "I'll watch her. My husband's deployed, I know what it's like. You go do what you do." Marcus hesitated only a second before transferring his daughter's weight to the woman's arms. The little girl looked uncertain but didn't cry. He knelt down to her eye level, his voice soft but clear. "Daddy has to go fly the plane for a little while, sweetheart. This nice lady will stay with you and I'll be back before lunch." Then he was moving, training overriding 8 months of dormancy, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. The sprint to the squadron building took 4 minutes. His flight suit was where he'd left it, name tape slightly faded, patches from 3 combat deployments still velcroed across the chest. The squadron duty officer, Lieutenant Morrison, had his gear already laid out. "Your aircraft's being prepped now, sir. Weapons load." Marcus shook his head while pulling on his G-suit, fingers working the connections with muscle memory that hadn't faded. "No weapons. This is close air support in a civilian area. I need eyes and options, not ordnance." The duty officer nodded, already moving to update the crew chief. Outside, the flight line shimmered in the morning heat. The F-16 waiting for him carried the tail number 87, the same aircraft he'd flown his last combat mission 18 months ago, before everything changed. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, stood by the ladder, helmet bag already in hand. "Thought you'd forgotten about us, Captain," Rodriguez said, but there was no judgment in it, just the quiet satisfaction of a maintainer seeing their pilot return. "Never forget," Marcus replied, taking the helmet bag, feeling its familiar weight. "Just had other priorities." The pre-flight checks went faster than they should have, his hands moving across switches and displays with the certainty of 15 years and 3,000 flight hours. The tower controller's voice in his headset was the same woman who'd been handling pattern work earlier, but the routine boredom had been replaced by sharp focus. "Havoc, Tower, you're cleared for immediate departure. Runway 27, winds 260 at 8, altimeter 3012. Maintain heading 285 after departure. Tactical frequency will be Blue 17. Havoc copies, rolling now," he responded, advancing the throttle, feeling the engine's response through the airframe like a conversation between old friends. The acceleration pressed him back into the seat, familiar and foreign simultaneously after 8 months of minivans and grocery carts. Rotation speed came and he pulled back on the stick, the wheels leaving concrete, the ground dropping away with the surreal speed that never stopped being magical even after all these years. His daughter was down there somewhere, probably asking the stranger holding her when Daddy would return. The thought sat in his chest like a physical weight, but he compartmentalized it the way he'd learned to compartmentalize everything else. The tactical frequency crackled as he established his climb. "Havoc, this is Sabre Operations. We have you on scope. Current situation as follows. Suspect barricaded in classroom 7, northeast corner, 2nd floor of Lincoln Elementary. 23 children confirmed inside, 1 teacher. Suspect has fired 4 rounds. No hits yet, but he's demonstrating familiarity with the weapon. All ground teams are pinned. We have 3 wounded responders." Marcus leveled at 3,000 feet, running the mental calculations automatically. "What's the building construction?" Sabre Operations came back immediately. "Standard base school, early 90s construction, brick exterior, standard windows, flat roof with HVAC units. The classroom in question has windows on both north and east faces." Marcus could see the school now, a low rectangular building surrounded by the organized chaos of emergency response. The parking lot was a maze of police vehicles, fire trucks, ambulances positioned just out of sight line from the 2nd floor. He could see movement around the perimeter, responders using vehicles for cover, the geometry of violence playing out in real time. "Sabre, Havoc has visual on target building, beginning reconnaissance run from the south," he transmitted, banking the F-16 into a gentle turn that would bring him over the school at an angle that minimized his acoustic signature. The last thing anyone needed was a fighter jet spooking an already unstable shooter. The first pass showed him everything. The building's layout, the approach angles, the sight lines from the second-floor windows. He could see the tactical team stacked up behind a brick wall 40 meters from the main entrance, could see the negotiator behind his armored vehicle, phone pressed to his ear. And there, in the northeast corner window, a shadow that moved wrong, too angular, the shape of a man with a rifle tracking movement in the parking lot. Marcus climbed back to altitude, his mind already building the tactical picture. Saber, Havoc, confirmed suspect, is actively tracking ground units from the north window. I have good visibility on his position, but no direct intervention capability without weapons authorization. The response was immediate. Negative on weapons, Havoc. This is a civilian area with children in the structure. We need options, not ordnance. Marcus had expected that. What he hadn't expected was the next transmission, a different voice, older, carrying the weight of stars on its shoulders. Havoc, this is General Stafford. I'm on-site commanding response. I need your assessment, and I need it honest. Can this be resolved without casualties? The question hung in the air while Marcus made another pass, lower this time, his camera pod recording every detail of the building's structure. He thought about his daughter, about the parent-teacher conference next week, about every father and mother waiting in that parking lot below. General, Havoc, honest assessment. Suspect has superior position and fields of fire on all ground approaches. Every minute that passes increases the probability of casualties. The building construction is standard. Windows provide clear sight lines for him and limited approach options for us. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then Stafford's voice returned, carrying a question that would define everything that came next. What would you do, Captain, if those were your own children in that classroom? Marcus didn't hesitate. Sir, if those were my children, I'd want someone in the air above them making sure every option was exhausted before we accepted an outcome. I'd want someone who could see the whole picture, who could coordinate every moving part, who could buy time for the negotiators and provide overwatch for the entry teams. I'd want someone who gave enough of a damn to tell me the truth even when it hurt. Another silence, shorter this time. Then Stafford's voice came back with the simple authority of a commander making the call that would either save lives or end his career. Havoc, you have tactical command of this operation. All ground and air elements will coordinate through you. The negotiator has 15 minutes to make progress. After that, the entry teams go and you're their eyes. Make it work. The responsibility settled across Marcus's shoulders like his daughter's weight had that morning, precious and terrifying in equal measure. He thought about the woman in the commissary, holding a stranger's child because some situations demanded strangers become something more. He thought about Rodriguez and Morrison, who'd prepped his aircraft without question because when the call came, you answered. He thought about 8 months of being invisible, of being dismissed, of being assumed finished. Saber actual, all ground elements. This is Havoc, he transmitted, his voice carrying the command authority of 15 years flying combat missions over places where hesitation measured in seconds meant death measured in lives. We're going to resolve this situation. We're going to bring those children home, and we're going to do it by working as a single coordinated element. Ground Commander, report your position and status. The next 12 minutes were a masterclass in crisis coordination, Marcus's fighter circling overhead like a guardian angel with jet engines, his eyes feeding information to ground teams who'd been working blind. He identified a maintenance access on the west side of the building that the shooter couldn't observe from his position. He noted the HVAC units on the roof that provided cover for a potential approach from above. He tracked the shooter's movement pattern, timing his appearances at the window, building a profile of behavior that the negotiator could exploit. And all the while, he thought about his daughter, probably asking the woman from the commissary if Daddy was in that airplane she could hear overhead. The negotiator's voice cut through the tactical frequency, tight with frustration. Havoc, negotiator, suspect is escalating, making demands we can't meet, references to not being respected, being ignored, being invisible. He's fired 2 more shots into the ceiling. Children are screaming. Teacher is trying to maintain calm, but situation is deteriorating rapidly. Marcus made another pass lower. His camera pod zoomed on the window where the shooter's shadow moved. He could see the rifle's outline now, could see the way the man paced, agitated, building towards something. The pattern was familiar from 3 deployments, the body language of someone who'd already committed to violence and was just working up the courage to finish what he'd started. Saber Actual Havoc, recommend immediate transition to entry phase. Suspect is escalating toward critical threshold. We're out of time. Stafford's response was instant. Entry teams, you're cleared hot. Havoc maintains overwatch and coordination. All elements execute on his mark. Marcus keyed the radio, addressing the tactical team leader directly. Ground 1, Havoc. I have eyes on suspect position northeast corner, 2nd floor. He's packing a 3-meter pattern from window to door, spending approximately 8 seconds at each position. Your entry window is when he moves to the door. That gives you 8 seconds of blind approach before he can reacquire visual on your position. Ground 1's voice came back steady despite the circumstances. Havoc, Ground 1 copies. We'll stack on the maintenance access west side. Need you to call the pattern when we move. Marcus banked hard, positioning himself for optimal view of both the window and the approaching tactical team. His radar altimeter showed 800 feet, low enough to see details, high enough to maintain the full tactical picture. He could see the team moving now. 4 operators in full kit advancing in a tight stack along the building's west wall, using every inch of cover the structure provided. The shooter appeared at the window again, rifle barrel tracking something in the parking lot, his attention fixed on the negotiator's vehicle. Marcus counted seconds in his head, matching the pattern he'd observed over the previous 20 minutes. 8 seconds at the window, then the shadow would recede, moving back to the door where he could monitor the classroom's entrance. Ground 1, Havoc. Execute on my mark in 5 seconds, Marcus transmitted, watching the shooter's shadow, feeling time compress the way it always did when everything balanced on the edge. 4-3-2 mark. The tactical team moved like a single organism, flowing around the corner toward the maintenance access, their movement smooth and fast and utterly silent from his altitude. Marcus kept his eyes locked on the window, watching for any sign the shooter had detected the approach. The shadow remained at the door position, packing, the rifle's outline visible in profile. Entry team reports access secured. Moving to interior stairwell came the whispered transmission from Ground 1. Marcus circled tighter, his eyes moving between the window and the building's exterior, looking for any change in the pattern, any indication that the advantage was slipping. Seconds stretched like hours. Then Ground 1's voice came through again, barely audible. Interior stairwell clear, moving to 2nd floor hallway. Classroom 7 is 3rd door on right. Suspect is audible making demands to the teacher. Marcus could see parents in the parking lot now, standing behind the police cordon, hands pressed to mouths, phones recording everything, hopping and praying, and dying slowly while strangers with guns tried to save their children. He thought about his daughter again, about the fierce protective love that made rational people do irrational things, about how quickly normal could become nightmare. Ground 1, Havoc, shooter just returned to window position. You have approximately 5 seconds before he moves back to door. Recommend holding for next cycle. But Ground 1's response carried a new urgency. Negative, Havoc, we have visual through door gap. Suspect is raising weapon toward children. We're going in now. The next 3 seconds happened in the strange slow-motion clarity that combat veterans knew intimately. Marcus watched the window, saw the shadow start to turn, heard the explosive breach of the classroom door through the tactical frequency, heard shouting and shots fired, and a child's scream cut short. Then silence. The kind of silence that could mean salvation or tragedy. The kind of silence that made your heart stop while your mind raced through every possible outcome. Ground 1's voice came through the radio, professional despite whatever he'd just witnessed. Havoc, Ground 1, suspect down. Children and teacher all secured. No civilian casualties. 3 team members with minor injuries from the breach situation contained. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, watching as the shadows in that second-floor window changed, became moving figures, small bodies being ushered toward safety by armored operators who'd probably have nightmares about this day for months. General Stafford's voice came through the frequency, steady with command authority and something that might have been relief. Havoc. Saber actual, outstanding work, maintain position, until all children are clear of the building, then return to base. Marcus acknowledged and continued his orbit, watching the organized chaos of emergency response shift from crisis to recovery. Ambulances moved closer. Parents broke through the cordon running toward the building's exits where children were emerging, some crying, some eerily silent, all alive. The woman holding his daughter in that commissary would be hearing about this within minutes, would understand why a stranger had handed her his most precious thing and run toward danger. His daughter would ask questions he'd struggle to answer, about why Daddy had to leave, about what he'd been doing in the sky, about whether the other children were okay. He'd answer as honestly as a 3-year-old could understand, would tell her that sometimes the adults had to help other families, that sometimes love meant running toward scary things instead of away from them. The last child emerged from the building 16 minutes later, a small girl in a princess backpack who ran into her father's arms with the desperate grip of someone who'd looked at mortality before learning multiplication. Marcus watched the reunion from 800 feet, professional detachment finally cracking, thinking about juice boxes and dinosaur chicken nuggets and parent-teacher conferences that suddenly seemed like the most important things in the universe. Havoc Tower, you're cleared to return to base. Runway 27, winds have shifted to 280 at 12. Marcus acknowledged and turned toward home, the familiar weight of mission accomplishment settling into his shoulders alongside the bone-deep exhaustion that always followed crisis operations. The landing was smooth, muscle memory, and 15 years of experience bringing the F-16 down with barely a chirp from the tires. Rodriguez was waiting by the parking spot, and the old crew chief's expression said everything his words wouldn't. Master Sergeant didn't waste time on sentiment, just gave a single nod that meant welcome back and good work in equal measure. The debrief took an hour, Marcus walking General Stafford, and the tactical team commanders through every decision point, every observation that had contributed to the successful resolution. The general listened without interruption, his weathered face impossible to read, his stars carrying the weight of responsibility that came with commanding thousands of lives and making decisions that ended careers or saved them. When Marcus finished, Stafford stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line, his back to the room. "Captain Chen," the general said slowly, "I've been in this uniform for 32 years. I've commanded combat wings in 3 different theaters, and I've seen plenty of pilots who were technically proficient but fundamentally missing the one thing that separates adequate from exceptional." Marcus remained silent, unsure where this was heading, still thinking about his daughter, probably wondering why Daddy was taking so long. Stafford turned to face him directly. "The thing that separates them is the ability to see the human cost of every decision, to feel the weight of responsibility not as a burden but as a calling, to understand that flying fighters isn't about personal glory or tactical excellence. It's about being the person other people can trust with their lives and their children's lives." The general crossed the room and extended his hand. "You've been working a desk for 8 months, being a single father, doing the hard, invisible work that nobody notices or appreciates, and I'm guessing you thought your fighter pilot days were finished." Marcus shook the offered hand, recognizing this moment as a turning point but uncertain which direction it would turn. "The thought had crossed my mind, sir." Stafford's expression might have been a smile, hard to tell with that weathered face. "Well, stop thinking it, Captain, because as of tomorrow you're back on the flight schedule, full combat status, and you're going to help me build a program that teaches other pilots what you demonstrated today. We need people who understand that the mission isn't about the aircraft or the weapon systems. It's about the lives we're protecting." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some combination of pride and terror and relief. "Sir, with respect, I still have a 3-year-old daughter who needs her father present, not deployed or dead. That hasn't changed." Now Stafford definitely smiled. "Then we'll make it work, Captain, because the military that can't figure out how to support a single parent isn't worth defending. You'll fly when you can, you'll be there for your daughter when she needs you, and somehow we'll balance it because that's what professionals do. They figure it out." The dismissal was clear, and Marcus saluted before heading for the door, his mind already racing through logistics and schedules and daycare pickup times. But Stafford's voice stopped him before he left. "One more thing, Captain." The general's expression had softened slightly, showing the father underneath the stars. "That woman from the commissary, Mrs. Anderson, her husband's a major deployed to Korea. She left her number with the duty officer, said your daughter did great, and she'd be happy to help with childcare when you're flying." Marcus felt something crack in his chest, the isolation of 8 months of single parenthood suddenly feeling less absolute. "Apparently word travels fast on base, sir." Stafford nodded toward the window where the flightline stretched beneath afternoon sun. "It's not a large community, Captain, and when someone demonstrates they're willing to risk everything for other people's children, the community takes notice. Go collect your daughter, take the rest of the day off, and report tomorrow morning ready to fly." The drive to the commissary took 6 minutes, Marcus still in his flight suit, sweat-stained and smelling of jet fuel and stress. The parking lot was half empty now, the lunch rush passed, but he spotted Mrs. Anderson immediately, sitting on a bench near the entrance with his daughter asleep against her shoulder. The little girl's face was peaceful, one small hand clutching the juice box that had started this entire chain of events. Mrs. Anderson looked up as he approached, her expression carrying something that might have been respect or recognition, or simply the shared understanding between parents who'd both watched their partners leave for dangerous things. "She did beautifully," Mrs. Anderson said quietly, standing and transferring the sleeping child to Marcus's arms. "Talked about you the whole time, about how her daddy flies planes and helps people." Marcus settled his daughter against his chest, feeling her steady breathing, the solid reality of her alive and safe in his. "I can't thank you enough for stepping in like that, Mrs. Anderson. You saved the mission before it started." She shook her head slightly, already gathering her own shopping bags. "That's what we do, Captain. We hold each other's children when the shooting starts, because tomorrow it might be reversed." She handed him a piece of paper with a phone number written in neat script. "General Stafford mentioned you might need backup sometimes. My daughter's 10 and excellent with little ones, and I have plenty of experience with deployment schedules and unpredictable hours." Marcus took the paper, recognizing this moment as something more than logistics, recognizing the community that he'd thought had stopped seeing him when he'd stopped flying. "The offer means more than you know," he managed, his throat tight with emotions he didn't have words for. Mrs. Anderson smiled, an expression that said she understood perfectly without needing the words. "Welcome back to the sky, Captain Chen. We've missed having havoc overhead." Then she was gone, walking to her car, leaving Marcus standing in the commissary parking lot holding his daughter and a phone number, and the sudden understanding that invisible didn't mean alone. The drive home was quiet, his daughter waking briefly to ask if he'd help the other kids, her 3-year-old logic making the connection between daddy leaving and daddy helping with the pure clarity of childhood. He told her yes, he'd help them, and now they were all safe and going home to their own parents just like she was going home with him. She nodded seriously, then asked if they could have dinosaur chicken nuggets for dinner because helping people made you hungry. Marcus laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuine joy, and agreed that dinosaur chicken nuggets were absolutely appropriate for today. That evening, after dinner and bath time and 3 stories read in his best dramatic voices, Marcus stood in his daughter's doorway watching her sleep, her breathing steady and sure, her small body completely trusting in the safety of her environment. He thought about the children in that classroom, about the seconds that had separated survival from tragedy, about the thin line between normal and nightmare. Tomorrow he'd return to the squadron, would start rebuilding the part of himself that had been dormant for 8 months, would figure out how to balance fatherhood and fighter pilot and all the complicated demands of both. Tomorrow he'd call Mrs. Anderson and work out childcare logistics, would meet with General Stafford about this new program, would start the difficult process of reintegration. But tonight, he just stood in the doorway and watched his daughter sleep, grateful for juice boxes and commissary lines and women who held strangers' children, because sometimes the call came when you least expected it and you answered because that's what community meant. His phone buzzed silently in his pocket. A text from Lieutenant Morrison at the squadron. "Just FYI, sir, CNN picked up the story. You're trending on social media. Something about the single dad pilot who saved the school. Thought you should know before tomorrow's brief." Marcus grimaced, already anticipating the attention he neither wanted nor needed, but underneath the discomfort was something else, something that felt like validation for 8 months of being dismissed and overlooked and assumed finished. He typed back a simple response. "Thanks for the heads up. See you at 700. Then he silenced his phone completely and returned to watching his daughter sleep, because viral videos and trending hashtags meant nothing compared to this quiet moment, this profound, orderly piece of a child safe in her bed while her father stood watch. The night passed slowly, Marcus eventually moving to his own room but sleeping lightly, ears attuned to any sound from his daughter's room the way they'd been attuned for 8 months of single parenthood. When morning came gray and cool through the windows, he was already awake, already planning the day's complex choreography of daycare drop-off and flight schedule and parent responsibilities. His flight suit hung ready in the closet, name tape and patches waiting like old friends who'd been patient during his absence. His daughter woke cheerful and chattering about dreams that involved talking dinosaurs and airplanes that could swim, her 3-year-old imagination blending reality and fantasy with the easy fluidity of childhood. Over breakfast, cereal for her, coffee for him, she asked the question he'd been expecting since yesterday. "Daddy, why did you have to help the other kids? Can't their daddies help them?" Marcus set down his coffee and looked at his daughter directly, recognizing this as a teaching moment that would shape how she understood service and sacrifice and community. Sometimes, sweetheart, the person who can help isn't the person closest to the problem. It's the person with the specific skills the problem requires. Those kids needed someone who could see from the sky, who could help the ground people understand what was happening, and Daddy knows how to do that because of his training. His daughter considered this seriously, milk dripping from her spoon back into the bowl. "So you helped because you could see what they couldn't see." The simple clarity of childhood cutting straight to the essential truth. "Exactly right," he confirmed, feeling proud of her comprehension. "And also because when someone needs help and you have the ability to provide it, you have a responsibility to try." She nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation, and returned to her cereal while asking if they could get a puppy that could also fly airplanes because that would be very helpful for everyone. The drive to daycare was familiar routine, his daughter singing songs about flying puppies while Marcus navigated morning traffic and planned the day ahead. The daycare director, Ms. Patricia, met them at the door with an expression that said she'd watched the news and had questions, but she was professional enough to save them for later. She just smiled at his daughter and welcomed her inside, giving Marcus a subtle thumbs up that carried more support than words could manage. The squadron building appeared unchanged as Marcus pulled into his assigned parking spot, but something felt different, some indefinable shift in the atmosphere that he couldn't quite identify. The difference became clear the moment he entered the ready room. Every pilot present stood up. It wasn't formal, wasn't attention or salute, just a spontaneous recognition from people who understood exactly what had happened yesterday and what it meant. Rodriguez was there, still in maintenance coveralls, and Morrison and Captain Torch, Williams, who'd been his wingman 3 years ago in Afghanistan, and a dozen others whose names and call signs formed the tribe that understood flight and danger, and the responsibility that came with both. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah "Knife" Martinez, the squadron commander, stepped forward first, her expression carrying that particular intensity that came from leading people into dangerous situations and bringing them home alive. "Welcome back, Havoc," she said simply, extending her hand. "We kept your spot warm." Marcus shook her hand, recognizing this moment as official reinstatement into the tribe he'd thought had moved on without him. "Appreciate that, ma'am, though I'm guessing my spot got pretty dusty over 8 months." Knife smiled slightly. "Nothing a good combat air patrol won't fix. You're on the flight schedule this afternoon with Torch as your wingman, just a standard training sortie to get you current again." Then her expression became more serious, the commander replacing the colleague. "But first, General Stafford wants to see you in the wing headquarters, something about a new program he's developing." Marcus had expected this, had spent part of last night thinking about what a program for single-parent pilots might look like, how to balance combat readiness with family responsibility without compromising either. The walk to wing headquarters took 5 minutes through morning sunshine that felt different somehow, sharper and more present than it had in months. The general's aide showed him directly into Stafford's office, where the wing commander sat behind a desk covered in reports and flight schedules and the organized chaos of leading 3,000 people. Stafford gestured to a chair without preamble. "Captain Chen, I've been thinking about yesterday's operation and about the broader implications for how we develop and retain talent in this service." Marcus sat, recognizing this was going to be a longer conversation than a simple welcome back. The general continued, his expression thoughtful. "We lose good pilots constantly, not because they can't fly or don't want to serve, but because life happens and the military traditionally hasn't been flexible enough to accommodate it. Divorce, single parenthood, family illness, any number of situations that force people to choose between service and personal responsibility." Marcus nodded, having lived this exact scenario for 8 months, having felt the weight of being invisible because his life no longer fit the traditional fighter-pilot profile. "Yesterday proved something important," Stafford said, leaning forward slightly. "It proved that a pilot who's been away from the cockpit, who's been focused on family responsibility, who doesn't fit the standard profile, can still perform at the highest level when the situation demands it." The general pulled out a folder, slid it across the desk. "I want you to help me build a program that identifies talented pilots who have stepped back for family reasons, that creates flexible schedules allowing them to maintain currency while meeting their personal obligations, and that keeps their skills sharp for exactly the kind of crisis we faced yesterday." Marcus opened the folder, scanning the preliminary outline that Stafford had apparently been developing even before yesterday's events. The program structure was ambitious: part-time combat status, flexible scheduling, dedicated childcare resources, mentorship networks connecting single parents with established support systems. "Sir, this is comprehensive, but implementing it will face resistance from traditionalists who believe combat aviation requires total commitment regardless of personal circumstances." Stafford's expression hardened slightly. "Then the traditionalists can explain to the parents of those 23 children why their rigid ideology was more important than having Havoc overhead when it mattered. This program isn't about lowering standards. It's about recognizing that life happens and good people are worth keeping even when their circumstances aren't perfect." Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of his own situation, recognition that yesterday hadn't just been about one crisis, but about challenging assumptions that had governed fighter aviation since its inception. The general continued, his voice carrying command authority that had been earned through 3 decades of difficult decisions. "You'll maintain your flight status, you'll help develop curriculum for this program, and you'll serve as proof of concept that flexibility doesn't mean diminished capability. We'll start with a pilot cohort of 5 people in similar situations, see what works and what doesn't, and build from there." Questions. Marcus had about 100 questions about scheduling and qualifications and standards and metrics, but underneath All the logistics was a simpler question that needed asking first. Sir, why me specifically? There are other pilots with families, other people who could develop this program. Stafford stood, walked to his window overlooking the flight line where fighters sat in their revetments waiting for pilots to bring them alive. Because you've lived it, Captain. Because you felt what it's like to be dismissed and overlooked and assumed finished. And because yesterday you proved that assumptions are just limitations we accept until someone demonstrates they're wrong. He turned back to face Marcus directly. And because when I gave you tactical command of that operation, you didn't hesitate, didn't make excuses, didn't blame your circumstances. You just performed like the professional you've always been, and that's the standard I want to build into this program. The meeting lasted another hour, Marcus taking notes and asking the 100 questions that had been building in his mind, Stafford answering some and admitting uncertainty about others, both of them recognizing they were building something unprecedented and important. When Marcus finally left the general's office, the morning had progressed to that particular quality of light that made the flightline shimmer like a mirage, heat waves rising from concrete that would be scorching by afternoon. His phone showed 3 missed calls, 2 from news organizations that he ignored immediately, and 1 from Mrs. Anderson with a voicemail that made him smile. Captain Chen, this is Susan Anderson. We met yesterday at the commissary. I wanted you to know that my daughter would love to babysit sometime, and also that my husband called from Korea last night after seeing the news coverage. Said to tell you that Havoc's reputation apparently extends to the Pacific Theater. Marcus saved the message, already composing a response about taking her up on the babysitting offer, about building the support network that would make this new version of his life sustainable. The afternoon training sortie with Torch went exactly as expected, slightly rusty on the radio procedures, muscle memory solid on the flying, the aircraft responding to his inputs like they'd never been apart. They ran basic air combat maneuvers over the restricted airspace, Marcus feeling his situational awareness, rebuild with each passing minute, the tactical picture becoming clearer as his brain re-engaged with the three-dimensional chess game of fighter aviation. Torch was professional throughout, matching Marcus's energy, pushing when appropriate and backing off when his wingman needed time to rebuild confidence. The post-flight debrief was thorough, Torch's assessment honest but encouraging. You're not quite where you were 8 months ago, he said bluntly, but you're also not starting from zero, and what you did yesterday bought you credibility that will last a career. Marcus appreciated the honesty, knew that sugarcoating would help no one, appreciated even more that Torch understood the difference between diminished skills and recoverable skills. That evening, picking up his daughter from daycare, Ms. Patricia mentioned that 3 other parents had approached her asking about Captain Chen, whether he was the pilot from the news, expressing gratitude and respect, and the particular emotion that came from recognizing someone had stood between danger and children. His daughter, oblivious to the adult complexities, chattered about her day, about finger painting and snack time, and how Tommy said his dad could fly planes but probably not as good as her dad because Tommy's dad wasn't on TV. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm, Marcus flying 3 times per week while building General Stafford's program, his daughter staying with Mrs. Anderson or her teenage daughter during flight operations. The squadron adapted around his schedule, other pilots adjusting their own commitments to ensure coverage, the tribe taking care of its own the way tribes always had when leadership made it clear that supporting each other wasn't optional. The first pilot selected for Stafford's program was Captain Jessica Frost Morrison, recently widowed with 2 elementary school children, considering separation from the Air Force because single parenthood and full-time fighter pilot seemed mutually exclusive. Marcus met with her on a Tuesday morning, both of them in flight suits, both carrying the weight of parental responsibility that traditional military structures hadn't been designed to accommodate. She was skeptical initially, guarded in the way people became when institutions had consistently demonstrated they valued mission over family. But as Marcus walked her through the program structure, through the flexibility and support systems, and the recognition that life happened and good pilots were worth keeping, her expression shifted from skeptical to cautiously hopeful. "This actually exists?" she asked, reviewing the support plan that included flexible scheduling, dedicated childcare resources, and mentorship from other parents who'd navigated similar terrain. "Or is this another feels-good briefing that disappears when implementation gets difficult?" Marcus understood her skepticism, had felt the same way until General Stafford made it clear this program carried wing commander support and budget allocation. "It exists," he confirmed, "and it exists because yesterday's crisis could happen again tomorrow, and we need pilots who can respond regardless of whether their personal circumstances fit the traditional profile." Jessica studied the documentation for another moment, then looked up with an expression that might have been relief or determination or both. "When do I start?" The program officially launched 6 weeks after the elementary school incident, with 5 pilots in various stages of reintegration. Jessica Morrison, Captain Robert Granite Hayes, who'd been primary caregiver for his disabled spouse, Major Patricia Echo Johnson, recently divorced with teenagers, Lieutenant Marcus Spark Williams, dealing with his own parents' declining health, and Marcus himself serving as both participant and program architect. General Stafford addressed them in a conference room that Tuesday morning, his expression carrying the weight of command authority and personal investment that made clear this program mattered at the highest levels. "You 5 represent something important," he began without preamble, standing at the front of the room while morning sunlight cut through the windows. "You represent the recognition that good people are worth keeping even when their circumstances aren't perfect, that flexibility isn't weakness, and that combat capability doesn't require sacrificing everything else that makes life worth living." He gestured to the flight schedule posted on the wall behind him, color-coded to show the complex choreography of flight operations and family responsibility that the program required. "This won't be easy, balancing flight operations with personal obligations, maintaining combat readiness while attending parent-teacher conferences and doctor appointments, and all the normal chaos of family life. There will be days when the mission conflicts with family needs, and we'll figure out solutions together rather than forcing you to choose between service and family." Jessica raised her hand, her expression cautious. "Sir, what happens when we can't figure out a solution? When the mission genuinely requires presence that conflicts with family emergency?" Stafford's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Then we find another pilot to fly the mission, because the military that destroys families to defend families has lost sight of why we serve in the first place." He let that statement settle for a moment before continuing. "Obviously, we're not running a daycare. We're running combat squadrons, and mission requirements don't disappear because someone has a sick kid. But we're also smart enough to build redundancy and flexibility that accounts for the reality that life happens." Marcus watched his fellow program participants process this, saw the cautious hope in their expressions, the recognition that maybe this institution could evolve beyond the rigid structures that had governed for generations. The general continued his brief, outlining expectations and standards, and the metrics that would measure program success or failure. Over the following months, the rhythm established itself through trial and error and constant adjustment. Marcus flew combat air patrols and training missions, developed curriculum for the program, spent evenings with his daughter building puzzles and reading stories, and creating the stable home environment she needed. Mrs. Anderson's daughter became a regular babysitter. Her husband returned from Korea deployment and made it clear the Anderson family was fully invested in supporting Havoc and his daughter. The squadron adapted, other pilots stepping up to cover when family emergencies occurred, the tribe strengthening rather than weakening under the flexible structure. There were difficult days when missions conflicted with daycare pickup and Marcus had to call Susan Anderson at the last minute, when his daughter got sick, and he missed a scheduled training flight, when the balance felt impossible and he questioned whether he was failing at both roles simultaneously. But there were also days when everything aligned, when he landed from a successful training mission and made it to daycare pickup with minutes to spare, when his daughter drew pictures of airplanes and proudly told anyone who'd listened that her daddy helped people from the sky. 6 months after the program launched, General Stafford called Marcus into his office for an assessment meeting. The general's expression was neutral, revealing nothing about whether this meeting would celebrate success or acknowledge failure. "Captain Chen," Stafford began, gesturing for Marcus to sit while remaining standing himself. "I've been reviewing the program metrics, talking to squadron commanders, and watching how this experiment has evolved over the past 6 months." Marcus waited, recognizing command pauses and knowing better than to fill them with nervous speech. The general continued, his voice carrying something that might have been satisfaction. "Every pilot in the program has maintained combat readiness. Several have exceeded their previous performance metrics. Squadron cohesion has improved rather than deteriorated. And we've received inquiries from 4 other bases about implementing similar structures." He finally sat down, fixing Marcus with that direct stare that had intimidated junior officers for 3 decades. "More importantly, we've demonstrated that the choice between service and family was always a false choice, that institutions can adapt without compromising standards, and that good leadership means recognizing people's worth beyond their ability to conform to traditional expectations." Stafford pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the preliminary outline from 6 months ago. "I'm recommending program expansion to every fighter wing in the Air Force, with you designated as the program architect and primary instructor for implementation." Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility settle across his shoulders, understanding that this moment transformed an experiment into institutional change, understanding that the implications reached far beyond 5 pilots at one base. "Sir, that's a significant commitment. I appreciate the confidence, but I need to be realistic about my own capacity while maintaining my family obligations." The general nodded, having clearly anticipated this response. "Which is why we're creating a dedicated staff position, reducing your flight operations to maintain currency while increasing your administrative time for program development. You'll serve as proof of concept that balance is achievable and as mentor for other bases implementing similar structures." Marcus considered this, running mental calculations about schedules and responsibilities and whether the trade-off made sense for his daughter's stability. Before he could respond, Stafford continued. "There's one more thing, Captain, something that came across my desk yesterday from the National Transportation Safety Board. The elementary school shooter's mother has been advocating for crisis response reforms, specifically around coordination between ground and air assets, and she's requested to meet with you to discuss the operation that saved her grandson." The air seemed to compress slightly in the office, the weight of that request carrying implications Marcus hadn't considered. The mother wanted to meet the pilot who'd coordinated the operation that killed her son while saving her grandson, wanted to talk about violence and response, and the complicated intersection of family tragedy and necessary force. "That's a complicated ask, sir," Marcus said carefully, recognizing the emotional minefield that meeting represented. Stafford's expression softened slightly, showing the father underneath the stars. "It is complicated," he agreed, "but she's not looking for someone to blame. She's looking for someone who can help her understand how it happened and why it had to end the way it did. I've read her initial letter. She's seeking closure, not confrontation." Marcus thought about his daughter, about the fierce protective love that made parents into warriors, about the impossible position of losing a child even when that child had chosen violence. He thought about the 23 children who'd gone home to their families, about the teacher who'd maintained calm during chaos, about the tactical team who'd made the hard call that ended one life to preserve many. "I'll meet with her," he said finally, recognizing this as part of the responsibility that came with command authority and tactical decisions. "But I'd like General Stafford or Squadron Commander present. This conversation shouldn't happen without witnesses and official structure. The general nodded approval. Good call. We'll coordinate through the public affairs office and legal. Make sure everyone's protected and the conversation serves healing rather than harm. The meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks later, enough time for both parties to prepare emotionally and logistically, enough time for Marcus to talk with the squadron psychologist about handling complex grief and moral injury from multiple perspectives. The night before the scheduled meeting, his daughter asked why he seemed distracted, her 3-year-old emotional radar detecting his preoccupation even when he tried to mask it. Marcus knelt down to her level, looking into brown eyes that saw more than most adults gave credit for. Daddy has to have a difficult conversation tomorrow with someone who lost someone they loved, and I'm trying to figure out the right words to use when there might not be right words. His daughter considered this with the serious expression she used when processing complex adult concepts, then reached out and patted his cheek with her small hand. Just tell them you helped because you could. That's what you told me. The simple clarity of childhood cutting through layers of complexity to the essential truth underneath. Marcus hugged her tightly, grateful for perspective that only came from 3-year-olds and their unfiltered understanding of the world. The meeting took place in a conference room at Wing headquarters, neutral territory that carried official weight without feeling institutional. The shooter's mother was in her late 60s, gray hair pulled back simply, hands that trembled slightly as she shook Marcus's hand and General Stafford's. Her name was Margaret, and her eyes carried the particular exhaustion that came from grief compounded by guilt, from losing a son and knowing that son had tried to take other parents' children. "Thank you for meeting with me, Captain Chen," she began, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I know this is unusual, possibly unwelcome, but I needed to speak with someone who was there, who can help me understand the last minutes of my son's life." Marcus gestured for her to sit, taking his own seat across the conference table while General Stafford positioned himself slightly to the side, present but not intrusive. "Mrs. Margaret, I appreciate your courage in requesting this meeting. I can't imagine how difficult the past 7 months have been for you." She smiled slightly, a sad expression that carried no joy. "The past 7 months have been about trying to understand how I missed the signs, how my son went from troubled to dangerous without me seeing it happening." Her hands were clasped tightly on the table's surface, knuckles white with tension. "But I'm not here to explain or excuse what he did. I'm here to thank you for saving my grandson, who was in that classroom, and to understand whether there was any possibility of a different outcome." The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy and complex, and carrying no easy answer. Marcus chose his words carefully, recognizing this conversation would shape this woman's ability to process grief and guilt for years to come. "Mrs. Margaret, I can walk you through the tactical situation as it developed, explain the decisions made and the reasons behind them, but I need you to understand that some questions don't have answers that provide comfort or closure." She nodded, her expression bracing for difficult truths. "I understand, Captain. I'm not looking for comfort. I'm looking for honesty." Marcus spent the next 30 minutes walking through the operation chronologically. The initial response, his arrival overhead, the reconnaissance runs that built the tactical picture, the coordination with ground teams, the pattern analysis that identified the shooter's behavior, and finally the decision to execute forced entry when the situation escalated. He spoke professionally but not coldly, acknowledging the human cost alongside the tactical necessity, never using euphemisms or softening language that might obscure what had actually happened. Margaret listened without interruption, tears running silently down her face at certain moments, her hands never unclenching from their tight grip on the table. When Marcus finished, silence filled the conference room for long seconds before she spoke. "Was there any moment, any decision point, where a different choice might have brought my son out alive?" The question Marcus had known was coming but dreaded answering, because honest response required acknowledging that possibility always existed, but probability made certain outcomes nearly inevitable. Mrs. Margaret, Marcus said carefully. There were multiple decision points where different choices might have led to different outcomes. If your son had responded to the negotiator's attempts at communication, if he'd released the children, if he'd surrendered his weapon, if he hadn't escalated by raising the rifle toward the students. But those were his choices, not ours, and once he made the choice to threaten children with immediate violence, our options collapsed to the single priority of preventing casualties. She absorbed this, nodding slowly, her expression showing the complex process of a mother trying to reconcile love for her son with acceptance of his actions. General Stafford spoke for the first time, his voice gentle but clear. Mrs. Margaret, I've commanded combat operations for 15 years. I've made decisions that resulted in casualties and lived with the weight of those decisions. What I can tell you with absolute certainty is that Captain Chen and the tactical team exhausted every option before using force, and the outcome, as tragic as it is for you personally, prevented a much larger tragedy. Margaret looked at the general, then back to Marcus, her eyes searching for something that might make sense of senseless violence. My grandson told me that in the last minutes before the door opened, he heard your airplane overhead and he knew help was coming. He said the sound made him feel safer even though he didn't understand what was happening. She paused, gathering herself. I wanted you to know that, wanted you to understand that even in that terrible situation, your presence provided comfort to frightened children. Marcus felt his throat tighten, the weight of that statement settling into the complex mix of pride and sorrow that came from crisis operations. He thought about his own daughter, about how she heard airplanes overhead and knew her daddy was working, about the innocent faith children had that adults would protect them from harm. Thank you for sharing that, he managed, his voice rougher than usual. Knowing we provided some measure of comfort matters more than I can adequately express. Margaret stood, indicating the meeting had reached its natural conclusion, but her expression had shifted slightly, showing something that might have been peace beginning to emerge from grief. Captain Chen, General Stafford, thank you for your honesty and for your service. My son made terrible choices that ended in tragedy, but because of your professionalism and humanity, that tragedy was limited to one family's loss instead of many families' losses. She extended her hand again, and Marcus shook it, recognizing this woman's courage in facing the person who'd coordinated the operation that killed her son, recognizing the complexity of grief that could hold both love for lost family and gratitude for lives preserved. After she left, General Stafford remained in the conference room, his expression thoughtful. That was one of the most difficult conversations I've witnessed in 32 years, he said quietly, and you handled it with exactly the right balance of honesty and compassion. Marcus collapsed back into his chair, the emotional weight of the past hour leaving him drained. Sir, how do you live with the knowledge that you did everything right and it still ended in tragedy for someone? Stafford's response carried the weight of decades making hard calls. You remember that the alternative was worse, that your actions limited harm rather than created it, and you acknowledge the human cost without letting it paralyze your ability to act when the next crisis comes. He paused, looking out the conference room window toward the flight line where fighters sat ready. And you build programs that support people through the complex aftermath of doing difficult necessary things, because nobody should carry that weight alone. The months continued to roll forward, Marcus balancing flight operations with program development, with fatherhood with the occasional recognition that came from being the face of a story that had briefly captured national attention. His daughter grew taller, started asking more complex questions about what daddy did at work, began to understand in her child's way that sometimes helping people meant difficult things that didn't have simple explanations. The program expanded, other bases implementing variations on the flexible structure that acknowledged life happened and good pilots were worth keeping. Jessica Morrison became an advocate, speaking at professional conferences about maintaining combat readiness while honoring family responsibility. Granite Hayes returned to full flight status after his spouse's health stabilized, crediting the program's flexibility with keeping him in service during impossible circumstances. A year after the elementary school incident, on a Tuesday morning that felt unremarkable until it wasn't, Marcus was in his office reviewing curriculum updates when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was young, male, nervous. "Captain Chen. This is Sergeant Michael Torres. I'm calling from Walter Reed. I served with you in Afghanistan 5 years ago, flight line maintenance." Marcus pulled up the memory. Young airman, brilliant with avionics, always first one on the line in the morning and last to leave at night. "Torres, of course I remember. What can I do for you?" The sergeant's voice carried strain. "Sir, I'm calling because I'm currently inpatient here for PTSD treatment. Been struggling since I separated from service 2 years ago, and my counselor suggested I reach out to people who knew me when I was functional." The statement carried layers of pain underneath its clinical phrasing. The struggle of veterans who returned from deployment changed in ways that made civilian life feel foreign and hostile. Marcus shifted mental gears immediately, program development forgotten in face of immediate human need. "Torres, I'm glad you called, and I'm glad you're getting help. What specifically can I do to support your recovery?" The conversation lasted 40 minutes, Torres describing his struggles with hypervigilance and rage, and the inability to find meaning in civilian employment after the focused purpose of military service. Marcus listened more than he spoke, offering connection rather than solutions, acknowledging the difficulty without minimizing it. Before ending the call, Marcus made a decision that felt right even if protocol was unclear. "Torres, I'm going to talk to some people about potential options for returning to service in a capacity that accommodates your current situation. No promises, but we've been building programs around flexibility and support, and it's possible there's a path forward." The sergeant's voice carried cautious hope. "Sir, I'd appreciate even just the conversation. Right now I need purpose more than I need promises." After disconnecting, Marcus sat in his office thinking about expanding circles of consequence, about how crisis response had evolved into program development, which was now evolving into veteran support networks. He called General Stafford, outlined the conversation with Torres, proposed expanding the flexible service program beyond parents to include veterans managing PTSD and other service-connected disabilities that traditional structures couldn't accommodate. The general listened without interruption, then was silent for several seconds before responding. "Captain, you're describing a fundamental reimagining of how we think about talent retention and service accommodation. This goes well beyond the single-parent program we started with." Marcus recognized the concern, understood the institutional resistance that came with expanding beyond proven concepts into uncertain territory. "Sir, with respect, the underlying principle is identical. Good people are worth keeping even when their circumstances don't fit traditional expectations. Whether those circumstances are family responsibility or health challenges or any other factor that traditional structures can't accommodate, the question remains the same. Do we want to keep talented people, or do we want to enforce rigid conformity?" Stafford's response carried something that might have been approval. "You're going to make a lot of senior officers uncomfortable with that philosophy, Captain, but you're also correct that the principle remains consistent. Let me think about how to structure this expansion without losing institutional support." 2 weeks later, Marcus received orders expanding his role from single-parent program architect to director of flexible service options, a newly created position with broad mandate to develop retention programs for personnel-facing circumstances that traditional military structures couldn't accommodate. The promotion to major came simultaneously, recognition that increased responsibility required commensurate rank authority. His daughter's reaction to the news was pure 3-year-old logic. "Does this mean you can fly bigger airplanes?" Marcus explained that rank didn't determine aircraft assignment, but appreciated her assumption that promotion meant expanded capability rather than expanded paperwork. The next phase of program development brought new challenges and new participants, veterans managing PTSD who could serve in administrative or training capacities, personnel caring for disabled family members who needed flexible schedules, service members pursuing advanced education while maintaining active status. Each case required custom solutions. Each solution required institutional flexibility that challenged decades of established procedure. There were failures alongside successes. Personnel who couldn't maintain performance standards despite accommodation. Programs that looked good on paper but collapsed under implementation pressure. Resistance from traditionalists who viewed flexibility as weakness rather than strength. Marcus documented both successes and failures rigorously, understanding that institutional change required evidence and honesty about what worked and what didn't. 18 months after the elementary school incident, CNN contacted Wing Public Affairs requesting an interview with Major Chen for a feature on military family programs. Marcus's initial instinct was to decline, avoid the spotlight that came with being the public face of institutional change. But General Stafford had other ideas, calling Marcus into his office to discuss the request. The general was direct. "Captain, apologies, Major. This isn't about personal publicity, this is about institutional change. Right now we have successful programs at a dozen bases, but we have resistance at 100 others. Media coverage that shows these programs working, that puts a human face on the policy, accelerates adoption more effectively than any command directive." Marcus understood the logic, but remained uncomfortable with the attention. "Sir, I'm not a public affairs specialist. I'm a pilot who stumbled into program development because circumstances demanded it." Stafford smiled slightly. "Which is exactly why your perspective matters. You're not selling policy, you're explaining how reality forced institutional adaptation." The interview aired 3 weeks later, Marcus in flight suit in the squadron-ready room, talking about balance and flexibility and the recognition that good people were worth keeping. The segment included footage of him flying with his daughter visible in brief clips of evening routine, other program participants discussing their experiences, General Stafford explaining the institutional benefits of retention over replacement. The response was immediate and substantial. Dozens of bases requesting program implementation guidance. Hundreds of service members reaching out describing their own circumstances and asking whether accommodation was possible, congressional staffers contacting the Air Force asking about expansion to other service branches. Marcus's office became command center for coordinating expansion. His days a blur of video conferences and policy drafts and consultation calls with commanders implementing programs at their installations. His daughter adapted to his increased visibility with the easy flexibility of childhood, occasionally asking why people wanted to take daddy's picture, but mostly unconcerned with adult complications. Mrs. Anderson remained constant support, her family integrated into Marcus's life in ways that felt more like extended family than neighborly assistance. Her daughter babysat regularly. Her husband, now returned permanently from Korea, became someone Marcus could call for advice on parenting and service balance. 2 years after the elementary school incident, on an afternoon that felt like any other until it wasn't, Marcus received a call from the White House Personnel Office. The voice on the other end was professional, formal, carrying the particular authority that came from speaking on behalf of executive power. "Major Chen, this is Jennifer Williams from the White House Personnel Office. The President would like to meet with you regarding your military family support programs and potential expansion across all service branches." Marcus sat down slowly, his mind processing the implications of presidential attention to what had started as an experiment at a single base. "Ms. Williams, I'm honored by the President's interest, but I should clarify that these programs have been developed by teams of people across multiple installations. I'm just one coordinator among many contributors." Williams's response suggested she'd expected this deflection. "Major, we're aware of the collaborative nature of the program development, but the president specifically wants to meet with you because you represent both the policy development and the lived experience that drove the policy creation. We're looking at next Thursday at 1400 hours. Can you accommodate that schedule? Marcus thought about his calendar, about flight operations and program coordination, and the parent-teacher conference scheduled for Wednesday, about his daughter, and whether bringing her to Washington was appropriate or complicated. Before he could formulate response, Williams continued, "We understand you're a single parent, Major. The president has requested that you bring your daughter if childcare would otherwise be an issue. We have facilities that can accommodate her during the meeting." The thoughtfulness of that accommodation, the recognition that even meeting with the president had to account for parental responsibility, felt like validation of everything the programs had been built to address. Marcus accepted, arranged coverage for his squadron duties, and spent the next week preparing briefing materials and managing his own nervousness about meeting the commander-in-chief. His daughter's primary concern was whether the president had dogs she could pet, her 3-year-old priorities refreshingly uncomplicated by political protocol. The flight to Washington was commercial, Marcus in civilian clothes trying to blend into the anonymous crowd of travelers, his daughter excited about airplane rides even though Daddy's airplane was cooler because it went faster and could do loops. The White House visit was surreal, security procedures and historical architecture, and the weight of standing in rooms where decisions affecting millions had been made for centuries. His daughter was appropriately awed, whispering questions about whether George Washington had walked these hallways, holding Marcus's hand tightly while they were escorted through corridors lined with portraits of previous presidents. The Oval Office was smaller than television suggested, more intimate, the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the Rose Garden. The president stood from behind the resolute desk, extending a hand with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command authority. "Major Chen, thank you for making the trip. I've been following your program development with interest and wanted to discuss potential expansion." They talked for 90 minutes, Marcus presenting data and case studies, the president asking pointed questions about implementation challenges and scalability, both of them focused on practical details rather than political optics. Marcus's daughter sat quietly in a corner with a White House staffer who'd brought coloring books and juice boxes, occasionally looking up to watch her father brief the president with the same concentration she'd watch him prepare dinner. Toward the end of the meeting, the president shifted from policy discussion to personal inquiry. "Major, can I ask what motivated you specifically to push for these programs?" Marcus considered the question, thought about juice boxes and commissary lines and women who held strangers' children, about being invisible until crisis made him visible again. "Sir, I was a single father working a desk job, dismissed as finished by people who couldn't see past traditional expectations. And when crisis came, I was able to respond because I'd maintained skills despite circumstances. That experience taught me that we lose good people constantly not because they can't perform, but because institutions can't accommodate normal human complexity." The president nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And now, you've built programs that accommodate that complexity while maintaining performance standards, which suggests the choice between flexibility and excellence was always false." "Exactly, sir," Marcus confirmed, recognizing the president understood the fundamental principle driving everything they'd built. The meeting concluded with presidential directive to the Secretary of Defense to implement flexible service programs across all branches, with Major Chen designated as senior military advisor for the implementation. The responsibility was overwhelming, the implications enormous, but Marcus accepted understanding this was the logical extension of everything that had started in a commissary checkout line 2 years ago. The flight home was quiet, his daughter asleep against his shoulder, Marcus staring out the window at clouds below and thinking about trajectory, about how single moments could cascade into institutional change, about the responsibility that came with being the face of that change. His phone buzzed with messages, congratulations from squadron mates, interview requests from media outlets, inquiries from service members hoping the program expansion would accommodate their circumstances. He answered the important ones, ignored the publicity requests, and focused on the practical work of turning presidential directive into implementable policy. The next 18 months were blur of travel and policy development and congressional testimony, and the grinding detailed work of institutional change. Marcus maintained his flight status through careful scheduling, maintained his relationship with his daughter through fierce protection of evening routine, maintained his sanity through the support network that had grown around him. Mrs. Anderson's family remained constant, Rodriguez and Morrison, and the squadron providing backup when travel required extended absence. The tribe taking care of its own the way tribes always had when leadership made clear that supporting each other wasn't optional. His daughter started kindergarten, began asking questions that required more sophisticated answers than toddler-level explanations, started to understand that daddy's work involved helping lots of families balance service and home. 3 years after the elementary school incident, on a spring morning that felt like new beginnings, Marcus stood at a podium in the Pentagon briefing room addressing senior leadership from all service branches. Behind him, slides displayed program metrics. Retention rates improved by 34% among participants, performance evaluations showing no degradation compared to traditional service members, cost analysis demonstrating that retention was significantly cheaper than replacement. But the real story wasn't in the statistics. It was in the faces of the people sitting in the audience. Jessica Morrison, now a lieutenant colonel commanding her own squadron. Sergeant Torres, returned to active duty in a training role that accommodated his PTSD management. Dozens of others whose careers had been preserved because institutions had learned to flex rather than break. Marcus concluded his briefing with a statement that had become the program's informal motto: "Good people are worth keeping, even when their circumstances don't fit traditional expectations. Our strength comes not from rigid conformity, but from our ability to retain and employ talent regardless of life's complexity." The applause was professional, measured, appropriate for Pentagon briefing rooms, but underneath Marcus sensed something more: recognition that institutional change was possible, that assumptions could be challenged, that military effectiveness and human compassion weren't mutually exclusive. General Stafford, now wearing 4 stars and serving as Air Force Chief of Staff, approached after the briefing concluded. "Major Chen, that was an outstanding presentation. You've built something that will outlast both our careers." Marcus felt pride mixed with exhaustion, the satisfaction of meaningful work alongside the reality that institutional change was never finished, always requiring maintenance and defense and evolution. "Sir, the programs are established, but they're not guaranteed. Every budget cycle and every command change risks reverting to traditional structures." Stafford's expression acknowledged the concern. "Which is why we're making this permanent through regulation rather than policy. Which is why we're building these principles into service academy curricula and professional military education. Which is why we're institutionalizing rather than experimenting." He paused, then continued with the particular tone that preceded significant announcements. "And which is why I'm recommending you for promotion to lieutenant colonel and assignment as the Deputy Director of Military Personnel Policy, where you can ensure these programs survive leadership changes and budget pressures." Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility, understood the implication that this was no longer temporary duty but career trajectory, that he'd become permanently identified with institutional change. His daughter was now 5 years old, starting to form permanent memories, beginning to understand Daddy's work in ways that would shape her own worldview. That evening, after returning home from the Pentagon, after pickup from kindergarten and dinner and bath time and stories, Marcus sat on the edge of his daughter's bed while she fought sleep. "Daddy," she asked with the sudden clarity of childhood insight, "are you going to keep helping families forever?" Marcus considered the question, thought about juice boxes and commissary lines and presidential meetings and Pentagon briefings, thought about trajectory and responsibility, and the choice between comfortable obscurity and visible service. Not forever, sweetheart, he answered honestly, but for as long as families need help, and I have the ability to provide it, I think that's what I'm supposed to do. She nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with this answer, then asked the follow-up question that only 5-year-olds asked without self-consciousness. But you'll still have time to be my daddy too, right? The question that contained everything important, the question that validated every program they'd built, the question that acknowledged the fundamental truth underneath all the policy and regulation. Always, he confirmed, kissing her forehead, feeling gratitude for the child who'd been patient through his absences, who'd shared him with institutions and programs and other families' needs. Being your daddy comes first, everything else comes second. She smiled, satisfied, and drifted toward sleep, while Marcus sat in the darkened room thinking about balance and priority, and the ways crisis had transformed him from invisible to visible, from dismissed to essential, from single parent struggling in checkout lines to architect of change that would affect thousands of families. 4 years after the elementary school incident, Major Chen received his promotion to lieutenant colonel and his new assignment, moving from squadron operations to Pentagon policy work, but maintaining flight status through monthly currency flights at Andrews Air Force Base. His daughter adapted to the move to Washington with resilience, made friends in her new school, occasionally visited Daddy's office where she charmed generals and policy analysts with equal effectiveness. The work was demanding but meaningful, defending program budgets against inevitable cuts, adapting policies to account for implementation lessons learned, expanding accommodation options as new circumstances emerged. There were victories: congressional authorization for expanded childcare funding, regulatory changes that made flexible service permanent rather than provisional, recognition from veterans organizations and military family advocacy groups. There were defeats: budget reductions that limited program scope, resistance from traditionalists who viewed any accommodation as weakness, personnel who abused flexibility and provided ammunition for program critics. Through it all, Marcus maintained focus on the principle that had driven everything from the beginning. Good people were worth keeping, institutional flexibility was strength not weakness, and military effectiveness required acknowledging human complexity. 5 years after the elementary school incident, on a Tuesday that felt unremarkable until it wasn't, Marcus received a call from Margaret, the elementary school shooter's mother, asking if she could visit him in Washington. They met at a coffee shop near the Pentagon, neutral territory that carried no official weight, just two people talking about violence and recovery, and the long, difficult work of finding meaning after tragedy. Margaret looked older but more peaceful, the raw grief replaced by something that resembled acceptance without quite being comfortable. She told him about her work with crisis response advocacy groups, about her testimony before state legislatures regarding school safety, about her grandson who was now in 3rd grade and thriving despite the trauma he'd experienced. "We talk about that day sometimes," Margaret said, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, "my grandson and I, and he always mentions hearing your airplane overhead, how the sound made him feel like help was coming." She looked directly at Marcus. "I wanted you to know that you've become part of his story in a positive way, that when he thinks about that day he doesn't just remember fear, he remembers being rescued." Marcus felt his throat tighten, the weight of that statement settling into the complex mix of emotions that crisis response always carried. "Mrs. Margaret, I appreciate you sharing that. Knowing we provided something positive in an impossible situation matters more than I can express." She smiled slightly, sad but genuine. "Captain Chen, forgive me, Lieutenant Colonel. You saved my grandson and 22 other children. You coordinated a response that prevented greater tragedy, and you did it while being a father yourself. That matters more than policy papers or program metrics. It matters because it's human and real, and it reminds us why we build institutions in the first place. They talked for another hour about recovery and resilience and the ways crisis shape people, about Margaret's advocacy work and Marcus's program development, about the unexpected paths that trauma forced people to walk. When they parted, Margaret hugged him briefly, a gesture that 5 years earlier would have seemed impossible, and thanked him for meeting her, for helping her find meaning in tragedy. 6 years after the elementary school incident, Lieutenant Colonel Chen stood in the rose garden of the White House, while the president presented him with the Defense Superior Service Medal for his work developing and implementing flexible service programs across all military branches. His daughter stood nearby, now 7 years old and old enough to understand the significance without being overwhelmed by it. The ceremony was brief, professional, appropriate for recognizing significant contribution without excessive celebration. But afterward, during the informal reception, something more meaningful occurred. Dozens of service members and family members who'd been helped by the programs approached Marcus, sharing stories of how flexibility had saved careers, preserved families, enabled continued service when traditional structures would have forced separation. A Navy lieutenant commander whose husband had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's, explaining how flexible scheduling allowed her to maintain her career while providing care. An Army captain who'd been able to pursue a graduate degree in cybersecurity while maintaining reserve status, thanking Marcus for creating pathways that acknowledged education and service weren't mutually exclusive. A Marine sergeant whose teenager had attempted suicide, describing how temporary schedule adjustment had allowed him to be present during crisis, while eventually returning to full duty. Each story was personal and powerful. Each represented lives affected by institutional willingness to acknowledge complexity and accommodate it rather than punish it. His daughter listened to some of these conversations, her 7-year-old mind processing adult complexity, beginning to understand that Daddy's work involved more than just flying airplanes or writing policies. That evening, after they'd returned to their apartment in Arlington, after dinner and homework and the normal routine that grounded them both, she asked the question that showed how much she'd understood. Daddy, all those people today, they were thanking you for helping them stay with their families while still being in the military. Marcus sat down next to her on the couch, recognizing this as teaching moment that would shape how she understood service and sacrifice and institutional purpose. That's exactly right, sweetheart. The programs we built help people balance being good service members and good family members simultaneously, instead of forcing them to choose one or the other. His daughter considered this seriously, the way she always did when processing important concepts. That seems obvious, she said with the clarity of childhood logic. Why didn't the military always do it that way? The question contained everything. The innocent assumption that institutions should serve human needs, the confusion about why obvious solutions required such effort to implement, the fundamental challenge to establish procedure that children made without realizing how radical their questions were. Because sometimes grown-ups create rules that make sense in one situation, but don't make sense in all situations, Marcus explained, and it takes someone recognizing the problem and being willing to challenge the old rules to create better ones. His daughter nodded, apparently satisfied, then asked if they could watch a movie before bed because all this serious talk made her brain tired. Marcus agreed, grateful for her ability to switch between profound insight and normal 7-year-old concerns, grateful for the grounding that parenthood provided against the intensity of institutional change work. 7 years after the elementary school incident, on a spring morning that felt like endings and beginnings simultaneously, General Stafford called Marcus into his Pentagon office for what he described as an important conversation about the future. The Chief of Staff's office was impressive, walls lined with photographs from a 35-year career, windows overlooking the Pentagon courtyard, where military members moved with purpose between meetings and duties. Stafford gestured for Marcus to sit, his expression unreadable in the way senior leaders cultivated when delivering news that could be positive or negative. Lieutenant Colonel Chen, the general began formally, "I've been reviewing your career trajectory and considering next assignments. You've spent 7 years developing and implementing flexible service programs. You've achieved institutional change that will outlast both our careers, and you've become the recognized expert on military family policy across all services." Marcus waited, recognizing this preamble was leading somewhere significant but uncertain which direction. "The programs are well established now," Stafford continued. "Regulations are in place. Implementation is broad and deep, and frankly, you've trained enough people that the work can continue without your daily involvement." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, recognition that this moment represented transition point between phases of his career. The general continued, his tone shifting slightly towards something that might have been approval or respect. "Which means it's time to ask what you want next, whether you want to continue policy work, return to full-time flying, take a command position, or pursue something else entirely." The question hung in the air while Marcus processed implications, thought about his daughter now in second grade, about the life they'd built in Washington, about whether he wanted to continue the visible public role or return to the anonymity of regular squadron operations. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "I appreciate the question and the opportunity to provide input on my next assignment. But before I answer, I need to understand something. Are these programs genuinely sustainable without my continued involvement? Or is this a polite way of suggesting my presence has become more liability than asset?" Stafford's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Lieutenant Colonel, these programs are institutionalized, budgeted, and regulated. Your continued involvement would be valuable, but is not necessary for program survival. This conversation is genuinely about what serves your career development and personal life, not about organizational need." Marcus felt relief at that clarification, allowed himself to consider what he actually wanted rather than what duty required. "Sir, if I'm honest, I'd like to return to flying as primary duty, maybe take a squadron command position. Let someone else be the face of family programs while I go back to being a pilot who happens to benefit from those programs rather than constantly advocating for them." The general smiled, the expression suggesting he'd expected this answer. "Already in the works, Lieutenant Colonel. There's a squadron command position opening at Langley in 4 months. F-22's 2-year command tour, close enough to Washington that your daughter's school situation doesn't require disruption." Marcus felt something that might have been excitement or anxiety or both, the prospect of returning to full-time flying after 7 years of primarily policy work feeling both natural and intimidating. The general continued, his tone becoming more personal. "Chen, you've done something remarkable. You've changed institutional culture in ways that typically take decades. But sustainable change requires building systems that outlast individual advocates, and we've reached that point. It's appropriate for you to step back from policy work and return to operational flying, both for your career development and for demonstrating that these programs serve rather than define participants." Marcus understood the wisdom in that framing, recognized that continuing as the face of flexible service programs would eventually become limiting rather than enabling. The next 4 months were transition period, Marcus training his replacement in the policy office, briefing incoming leadership on program status and future challenges, preparing for the move to Langley and the return to squadron command. His daughter was excited about the move, the prospect of being closer to the beach outweighing any concerns about changing schools. Mrs. Anderson remained in Washington but promised to visit, her family having become extended family through 7 years of crisis and support and shared responsibility. The change of command ceremony was traditional military formality, Marcus assuming command of the 27th Fighter Squadron with the requisite speeches about heritage and mission and responsibility. But underneath the ceremony was personal significance, Return to primary identity as fighter pilot rather than policy advocate. Return to leading people in direct operational capacity rather than through institutional influence. His daughter attended the ceremony, now 8 years old and understanding enough to be proud without being overwhelmed, watching her father accept command with the serious expression she used when recognizing important moments. The first few months of command were adjustment period, Marcus rebuilding tactical proficiency while learning the administrative demands of leading a squadron, balancing flight operations with personnel management and all the complex demands of command. The squadron included 3 pilots participating in flexible service programs, a single mother, a captain caring for disabled parent, a major pursuing a graduate degree, and Marcus's presence as commander signaled that program participation didn't limit career progression. 8 years after the elementary school incident, Lieutenant Colonel Chen was flying regular combat air patrols, leading a fighter squadron, and living a life that balanced operational demands with family responsibility in ways that would have been impossible before the programs he'd helped build. His daughter thrived in Virginia, made friends easily, occasionally visited the squadron where pilots made time to explain aircraft systems and show her cockpits and treat her like the squadron mascot she'd unofficially become. There were difficult days when mission requirements conflicted with parent-teacher conferences, when his daughter got sick and he had to find backup for scheduled flights, when the balance felt impossible despite all the systemic support that now existed. But there were also days when everything aligned perfectly, when he landed from an outstanding training mission and made it to his daughter's soccer game with minutes to spare, when the squadron performed exceptionally, and he felt pride in leadership alongside pride in fatherhood. 9 years after the elementary school incident, on an afternoon that felt like any other, Marcus was in his office reviewing training schedules when his phone rang with a call from the Pentagon. General Stafford's voice carried the particular urgency that preceded significant news. "Chen, I need you back in Washington tomorrow. There's been a situation. The Secret Service prevented a potential threat against the President, and the First Lady has requested to meet with you specifically regarding family security programs." Marcus felt the familiar compression of time that preceded crisis response, the sudden shift from routine to urgent. "Sir, can you provide more context about what the First Lady is specifically requesting?" Stafford's response was clipped. The threat was from a former service member who'd been separated for mental health reasons, who felt abandoned by the institution, and who apparently focused his rage on the President as symbol of that abandonment. "The First Lady wants to discuss how we support service members after separation, how we prevent this kind of radicalization, and how your programs might be expanded to address veteran transition." Marcus understood the implications immediately, recognized this as expansion of the original principle into new territory, felt both the weight of that responsibility and the appropriateness of the evolution. "Sir, I'll be there tomorrow, but I should mention I'm not an expert in veteran transition or mental health support. My programs have focused on active service retention." Stafford's response carried something that might have been dry humor. "Lieutenant Colonel, 7 years ago you weren't an expert in flexible service programs either, but that didn't stop you from building them. Sometimes expertise comes from being willing to engage with problems that others avoid because they're complex and uncomfortable." The meeting with the First Lady took place in the White House residence, informal setting that felt more like living room conversation than policy discussion. She was direct, asking Marcus to explain how the flexible service programs had developed, what principles guided their implementation, and how those principles might apply to veteran transition support. Marcus talked about recognition that good people were worth keeping, about institutional flexibility as strength rather than weakness, about building support systems that acknowledged human complexity rather than punishing it. The First Lady listened carefully, asking pointed questions about implementation challenges and how to prevent program abuse while maintaining accessibility. Toward the end of the conversation, she shifted to more personal territory. Lieutenant Colonel Chen, you built these programs while raising a daughter alone, while managing all the complexity that single parenthood entails. How did you maintain perspective? How did you avoid burning out while trying to change institutional culture? Marcus thought about that question, about juice boxes and commissary lines and women who held strangers' children, about the support networks that had sustained him through impossible periods. Ma'am, I maintained perspective by remembering that the work wasn't abstract policy. It was about real families facing real challenges, and any time I felt overwhelmed, I thought about my daughter and about the other parents who needed these programs to exist. The First Lady nodded, her expression suggesting she understood that motivation intimately. The meeting concluded with her request that Marcus develop preliminary concepts for veteran transition support programs, with recognition that this would require additional time and resources beyond his current squadron command responsibilities. The next 12 months were intense, Marcus splitting time between squadron command and policy development. His daughter, now 9 years old and increasingly independent, Mrs. Anderson having relocated to Virginia to be closer to her grandchildren, and continuing to provide backup when his schedule became impossible. The veteran transition programs took shape slowly, built around the same principles as the flexible service programs, but adapted to address the unique challenges of post-service adjustment. There were focus groups with veterans, consultations with mental health professionals, coordination with Veterans Affairs and other agencies that served former service members. The work was difficult and sometimes heartbreaking, hearing stories of veterans who'd struggled with transition, who'd felt abandoned by institutions they'd served faithfully, who'd turned desperation into anger and anger into violence. But there were also stories of successful transition, veterans who'd found purpose after service, who'd built meaningful civilian lives while maintaining connection to military community. 10 years after the elementary school incident, on a morning that felt like completion of some long cycle, Marcus stood in the Pentagon briefing room presenting the veteran transition support programs to the same senior leadership he'd briefed years earlier about flexible service programs. Behind him, slides displayed the principles that had remained constant: recognition that good people deserved support, that institutional flexibility was strength rather than weakness, that prevention was more effective than crisis response. The briefing included personal testimony from veterans who'd participated in program development, from mental health professionals who'd contributed expertise, from family members who'd supported veterans through difficult transitions. When Marcus concluded, the applause was more than professional courtesy. It was recognition that he'd done it again, had taken an impossibly complex problem and built practical solutions that honored both institutional need and human dignity. General Stafford, now approaching retirement after 38 years of service, approached after the briefing. Lieutenant Colonel Chen, that was your best work yet. You've built something that will save lives and prevent the kind of tragedy that motivated this entire effort. Marcus felt satisfaction but also exhaustion, recognition that 10 years of crisis response and program development and institutional change had taken their toll, that perhaps it was time to consider his own transition. Sir, Marcus said carefully, I appreciate the recognition, but I need to be honest about my own capacity. I've been running at maximum effort for a decade. My daughter is about to start middle school, and I'm concerned that continuing this pace isn't sustainable for either of us. Stafford's expression suggested he'd been expecting this conversation. What are you thinking, Chen? Early retirement? Transition to reserve status? Something else? Marcus had been considering options for months, weighing duty against personal need, trying to determine what sustainable service looked like after a decade of intensity. I'm thinking maybe transition to reserve status, maintain currency, and provide consultation on the programs I've developed, but step back from full-time active duty and focus more on being present for my daughter while she navigates adolescence. The general nodded slowly, his expression showing understanding without judgment. "That's reasonable, Lieutenant Colonel. You've given more than anyone had right to expect. You've built programs that will outlast both our careers, and it's appropriate to prioritize your family after a decade of institutional service." The transition to reserve status took 6 months, Marcus completing his squadron command tour, training his replacement, preparing for the shift from active duty to reserve component. His daughter was excited about the prospect of having him home more consistently, less concerned with military status than with whether this meant more time for soccer games and homework help. The retirement ceremony was small, intimate, just squadron members and close colleagues. General Stafford presenting Marcus with the Legion of Merit for exceptional service over 11 years, developing and implementing programs that had fundamentally changed military culture regarding family accommodation and veteran transition support. During his remarks, Marcus kept them brief, focused on gratitude for the people who'd supported him through impossible periods, recognition that sustainable change required collaborative effort rather than individual heroics. But he ended with the statement that had become his personal philosophy, the principle that had guided everything he'd built. "Good people are worth keeping," he said, looking at the assembled squadron members who represented the program's success. "Institutional strength comes from flexibility rather than rigidity, and our effectiveness as a military depends on recognizing that the people who serve are complex humans with families and challenges and needs that don't fit neatly into regulation boxes." His daughter attended the ceremony, now 11 years old and understanding the significance of the moment, watching her father receive recognition with pride that needed no words. Afterward, during the informal reception, she approached General Stafford with the directness that characterized her personality. "General," she said seriously, "thank you for supporting my dad while he was helping all those families. It meant a lot to us." Stafford knelt down to her eye level, his weathered face showing the father underneath the stars. "Your dad is exceptional, young lady, and part of what made him exceptional was having you as his reason to keep pushing when things got difficult. You should be proud of him, but he should also be proud of you for being patient while he did important work." She smiled, satisfied with that recognition, then asked if there were cookies at this reception because ceremonies made people hungry. The transition to civilian life was gradual, Marcus maintaining reserve status and flying 1 weekend per month, consulting on program implementation at various bases, but primarily focusing on being present for his daughter through the complex terrain of middle school. The work he'd built continued without him, programs evolving and adapting but maintaining the core principles that had driven their creation. There were occasional recognition events, awards and speaking engagements and requests for interviews, but Marcus declined most of them, preferring to let the work speak for itself rather than continuing as its public face. 12 years after the elementary school incident, on a Saturday morning that felt like ordinary domestic life, Marcus was making breakfast while his daughter did homework at the kitchen table when his phone rang with an unknown number. The voice on the other end was young, female, tentative. "Colonel Chen, this is Sarah Martinez. You probably don't remember me, but I was one of the students in that classroom 12 years ago, the one your airplane was overhead for." Marcus set down the spatula, memory flooding back of that second-floor window, the shadow with the rifle, the 23 children who'd gone home because intervention had been successful. "Sarah, of course I remember, not your name specifically, but I remember that classroom and those children. How are you?" The young woman's voice carried emotion that transcended the phone connection. "I'm good. I'm actually in college now studying criminal justice because what happened that day made me want to understand crisis response and how to prevent violence. I'm calling because I wanted to thank you. I know you probably don't remember individual faces, but your voice on the radio, the sound of your airplane, it made me feel like someone was watching over us." Marcus felt his throat tighten, recognition that the people he'd saved had grown up, had built lives, had been shaped by trauma but not defined by it. "Sarah, thank you for calling. Thank you for letting me know you're thriving. It means more than you can possibly understand." They talked for 20 minutes, Sarah describing her education and career plans, her work with school safety organizations, her advocacy for better crisis response training. She mentioned that several other students from that classroom had remained friends, that they occasionally talked about that day, that Marcus's presence overhead had become part of their shared story. Before ending the call, Sarah asked one more question. "Colonel Chen, do you ever think about that day? Does it still affect you?" Marcus looked at his daughter, now 13 and growing into the person she'd become, thought about the trajectory of his life that had started with juice boxes and commissary lines, and cascaded through institutional change and program development. "Every day," he answered honestly, "not in a way that's traumatic, but in a way that reminds me why the work mattered, why building programs to support families and service members was worth the effort, why choosing to respond when the call came was the only choice that made sense." After the call ended, his daughter looked up from her homework with the expression that meant she'd been listening and processing. "Dad," she said, using the more mature title that had replaced Daddy sometime in the past year, "that was one of the kids from the school thing." Marcus nodded, recognizing this as another teaching moment, another opportunity to help his daughter understand service and responsibility, and the long-term consequences of choosing to help when help was needed. That was Sarah. She was 7 years old when it happened. She's 19 now and studying to work in crisis prevention, because what she experienced that day shaped how she thinks about helping people. His daughter considered this seriously, the way she always did when processing complex concepts. "So the thing you did 12 years ago is still helping people today, not just because of the programs you built, but because the people you saved grew up and are paying it forward." The clarity of that insight, the recognition of ripple effects cascading through time, made Marcus smile. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Everything we do affects other people in ways we might never see, which is why choosing to help when we have the ability matters more than we usually recognize." She nodded, apparently satisfied, then returned to her homework while Marcus finished making breakfast, thinking about juice boxes and commissary lines and airplane sounds that made frightened children feel safer, thinking about the long arc of consequence that started with small choices and cascaded into lives saved and programs built and institutions changed. 13 years after the elementary school incident, Marcus Chen, now fully transitioned to civilian life but maintaining reserve officer status, received an invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy about leadership and institutional change. He almost declined, preferring the quiet obscurity of civilian life, but his daughter encouraged him to accept, arguing that sharing the story mattered for future officers who'd face their own impossible choices. The speech was scheduled for late spring, Marcus traveling to Colorado Springs with his daughter, who was fascinated by the Academy's mountain setting and dramatic architecture. The auditorium was packed with cadets, their young faces showing the optimism and determination that preceded the complicated reality of military service. Marcus stood at the podium without notes, having lived the story too thoroughly to need written reminders, and began with the image that had started everything. 13 years ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I was standing in a commissary checkout line holding my 3-year-old daughter, and nobody was looking at me. Nobody saw me as anything other than another tired parent grinding through weekly shopping. Then a crisis happened, and suddenly I was visible again. Suddenly my skills mattered. Suddenly the institution remembered I existed." He paused, letting that image settle, then continued. "That experience taught me something fundamental about military service and leadership. We lose good people constantly not because they can't perform, but because institutions can't accommodate normal human complexity, and sustainable excellence requires building flexibility rather than demanding conformity." He talked for 45 minutes, telling the story chronologically, acknowledging mistakes alongside successes, being honest about the exhaustion and difficulty, alongside the satisfaction of meaningful work. The cadets listened with intensity that came from recognizing this wasn't theoretical leadership discussion, but lived experience from someone who'd navigated the terrain they'd soon enter. During the question period, a female cadet stood, her expression serious. "Sir, how do you balance the mission requirements that demand absolute commitment with the family responsibilities that also demand absolute commitment, especially when those demands conflict?" Marcus smiled, recognizing this as the fundamental question that everything ultimately returned to. "The honest answer," he said, "is that you don't balance them perfectly. You make choices that prioritize immediate needs while building support systems that prevent those choices from becoming unsustainable. Sometimes the mission comes first because lives depend on it. Sometimes family comes first because your children need you present. And sustainable service means building institutions flexible enough to accommodate both rather than forcing people to choose one permanently." Another cadet asked about dealing with criticism from traditionalists, about handling resistance to institutional change, about maintaining conviction when easier path would be accepting status quo. Marcus's response was direct. "You'll face criticism anytime you challenge established procedure, regardless of whether your challenge is justified or reasonable. The key is focusing on the principle driving the change rather than the personalities opposing it, building evidence that supports your position, and recognizing that institutional change happens slowly through persistence rather than quickly through dramatic gestures." The questions continued for another 30 minutes, cadets asking about specific program details, about implementation challenges, about how to recognize when change was needed versus when tradition served important purpose. Marcus answered honestly, acknowledging complexity rather than oversimplifying, treating these future officers with the respect they'd need to navigate their own impossible situations. After the formal speech concluded, several cadets approached individually, sharing their own family situations, asking whether the flexible service programs might accommodate their particular circumstances, expressing gratitude that someone had built pathways that acknowledged life's complexity. One cadet, a senior preparing to commission, pulled Marcus aside with visible emotion. "Sir, my mother has early onset Alzheimer's. I've been planning to decline my commission because I thought serving meant abandoning her. Hearing about your programs, knowing that flexibility exists, it means I might not have to choose between service and family." Marcus felt the weight of that statement, recognition that 13 years after standing in a commissary line, the ripples continued spreading in ways he'd never directly witnessed. "The programs exist because people like you deserve to serve without sacrificing everything else that gives life meaning," he told the cadets seriously. "Talk to your assignment officer, explain your situation, and we'll figure out how to accommodate both your mother's needs and the Air Force's needs." That evening, sitting in a Colorado Springs restaurant with his daughter, Marcus reflected on the day and the strange trajectory his life had taken since that Tuesday morning in a commissary. His daughter, now 14 and increasingly sophisticated in her thinking, asked the question that showed how much she'd understood. "Dad, do you ever wonder what would have happened if that shooting hadn't occurred, if you just stayed at your desk job and nobody had remembered you could fly?" Marcus considered that alternate timeline, imagined a version of his life where institutional invisibility had become permanent, where the programs had never been built, where thousands of service members had continued choosing between career and family because flexibility didn't exist. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, not with regret for what happened, but with recognition of how much depended on circumstances beyond anyone's control, on the woman who held my daughter while I ran toward danger, on General Stafford being willing to take a chance on someone who'd been dismissed as finished. His daughter nodded thoughtfully, processing this recognition of contingency and luck alongside skill and determination. "But you did the work once the opportunity appeared," she said, "like you always tell me. Preparation meeting opportunity is what creates success." Marcus smiled, recognizing his own words reflected back with the clarity of adolescent logic. Exactly right, sweetheart. The crisis created the opportunity, but the program succeeded because a lot of people were willing to do difficult work building something that didn't exist before. 14 years after the elementary school incident, Marcus Chen received notification that he'd been selected for promotion to colonel in the reserves, recognition that his contributions had been significant enough to warrant continued advancement despite transition from active duty. The promotion ceremony was small, just family and close friends. His daughter now preparing for high school and old enough to understand the full scope of what her father had built over the past decade and a half. General Stafford, now retired but still maintaining connection to people he'd commanded, attended the ceremony and provided the promotion oath, his weathered face showing satisfaction at seeing the trajectory complete. After pinning on the new rank, Stafford addressed the small gathering. Colonel Chen built programs that changed institutional culture across all service branches, he said simply, and he did it while being a single father, maintaining flight status, and demonstrating that excellence doesn't require sacrificing everything else that makes life meaningful. The statement was simple but carried weight from someone whose career had spanned 4 decades and who'd seen countless officers come and go. Marcus's response during his own remarks was equally straightforward. I built programs because circumstances forced recognition that institutions needed to adapt, he said, looking at the assembled friends and family who represented the support network that had sustained everything. But the program succeeded because thousands of people chose to implement them honestly, because commanders prioritized people over rigid procedure, and because military members demonstrated that flexibility strengthened rather than weakened combat capability. His daughter watched from the front row, her expression showing pride without excessive emotion, understanding that this ceremony represented culmination of work that had shaped her entire childhood. 15 years after the elementary school incident, on a spring morning that felt like bookend to the journey that had started in a commissary checkout line, Marcus received a call from the Air Force Chief of Staff requesting his presence at a Pentagon ceremony. The ceremony was formal, Marcus wearing his dress blues with the eagles on his shoulders that had seemed impossible during those 8 months of desk duty and invisibility. The Chief of Staff, a different officer than Stafford but someone who'd witnessed the program development, stood at the podium addressing several hundred attendees. Today we're recognizing Colonel Marcus Chen for sustained exceptional service over 15 years, developing and implementing programs that fundamentally changed how our military accommodates the complexity of human life while maintaining combat effectiveness. The citation was read, describing program metrics and institutional impact, and the thousands of service members whose careers had been preserved, because someone had challenged assumptions about what was possible. But the real recognition came after the formal ceremony, when a line formed of service members and family members who'd been affected by the programs, each person taking a moment to shake Marcus's hand and share brief stories of how flexibility had saved their careers, preserved their families, enabled continued service when traditional structures would have forced separation. Jessica Morrison, now a full colonel commanding a wing, was there representing the original program cohort. Granite Hayes attended, having retired as a lieutenant colonel but maintaining connection to the community that had supported him through impossible times. Sergeant Torres came from Walter Reed, where he now worked as a counselor helping other veterans navigate PTSD and transition challenges. And Sarah Martinez, the student from that classroom 15 years earlier, attended representing the 23 children who'd been saved because a single father had answered the call when it came. She approached Marcus near the end of the reception, her expression carrying emotion that transcended the formal setting. Colonel Chen, I wanted to thank you personally for saving my life 15 years ago, but also for building programs that helped my father later when he needed flexibility to support our family after my mother got sick. Sarah's statement crystallized everything. The recognition that the work had created ripple effects cascading through time in ways no one could have predicted. That choosing to help when the call came created consequences that echoed through generations. That evening, back home in Virginia, Marcus and his daughter sat on their apartment balcony watching the sun set over the Potomac, both quiet with the comfortable silence that came from not needing words to communicate understanding. "Dad," his daughter said eventually, using the thoughtful tone that preceded significant questions, "do you think about that day in the commissary? About what would have been different if you'd said no when they called? If you decided being a single parent meant you couldn't also be a fighter pilot?" Marcus had thought about that question countless times over 15 years, had examined that decision from every angle, had recognized both the privilege and burden that came from having the ability to respond when others couldn't. "I think about it constantly," he answered honestly, not with regret, but with recognition that everything that followed depended on that single moment of choosing to help when help was needed, on trusting that someone would hold my daughter while I ran toward danger, on believing that purpose mattered more than safety. His daughter nodded, processing this with the increasingly sophisticated thinking that characterized her impending adulthood. "And now thousands of families have the same choice you had, the ability to serve without abandoning everything else that matters, because you were willing to show it was possible." The simple clarity of that statement, the recognition of purpose achieved and impact multiplied, made Marcus feel something that might have been peace or completion, or simply the satisfaction of meaningful work done well. They sat in companionable silence while the sun completed its descent, the lights of the Pentagon visible across the river, representing the institution that had evolved because crisis had demanded it, and people had been willing to do difficult work making evolution real. Somewhere in bases across the country and around the world, service members were picking up their children from daycare, attending parent-teacher conferences, caring for disabled family members, pursuing education while maintaining readiness, living complex lives that traditional military structures would have punished, but that flexible programs now accommodated. Somewhere, veterans were transitioning successfully to civilian life because support systems existed to help them find purpose after uniformed service, because institutions had recognized that abandonment after service betrayed everything military service claimed to represent. Somewhere, children were hearing airplane sounds overhead and feeling safer because someone was watching, because adults had built structures that prioritized protecting the vulnerable over maintaining rigid conformity. And somewhere, in a commissary checkout line, another single parent stood holding a child while juggling groceries and responsibilities, visible or invisible depending on whether crisis would come to make their skills suddenly relevant. Marcus thought about that parent, about the skills they held that might never be recognized, about the potential that institutions might miss because accommodation seemed difficult or exceptional circumstances didn't fit established categories. He thought about juice boxes and women who held strangers' children, about General Stafford taking a chance on someone who'd been dismissed as finished, about 15 years of building programs that acknowledged human complexity rather than punishing it. His daughter stirred beside him, preparing to go inside and finish homework, living the normal teenage life that had been possible because institutions had learned to accommodate rather than demand absolute choice. Before she left, she hugged him briefly, the gesture carrying gratitude and affection and recognition that they'd navigated impossible terrain together and emerged stronger for it. "Dad," she said simply, "I'm proud of you, not just for the programs or the medals or any of that, but for showing me that choosing to help when you're able is what makes everything else meaningful." Then she was gone, returning to homework and teenage concerns, leaving Marcus alone on the balcony thinking about choices and consequences, and the long arc of service that had started with crisis, and ended with thousands of families given the same opportunity he'd had, to serve with honor while also being present for the people who gave service meaning in the first place. The evening deepened into night, the city lights reflecting off the Potomac, the distant sound of aircraft overhead carrying the promise that someone was watching, someone was ready, someone would answer when crisis came calling. Marcus sat for a long time, remembering and reflecting and recognizing that his story, from invisible single parent in a checkout line to architect of institutional change, represented possibility more than exceptionalism, represented what happened when institutions prioritized people over procedure, and when individuals chose purpose over comfort. Eventually he stood, preparing to go inside and resume the ordinary domestic life that had been extraordinary's foundation, carrying with him the satisfaction of knowing that the work had mattered, the programs would outlast him, and the principle that had driven everything remained simple and profound. Good people were worth keeping, even when their circumstances didn't fit traditional expectations, because strength came from accommodation rather than rigidity, and excellence required acknowledging the full complexity of human life rather than demanding impossible choices between service and everything else that made life worth living. The lights of the Pentagon glowed across the river, representing continuity and evolution, tradition and adaptation, the institution that had learned to flex rather than break, because one single father had stood in a commissary line holding his daughter and a basket of groceries, and when the call had come, had answered because sometimes love meant running toward danger, and sometimes service meant building structures that let other people answer too. And sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply demonstrate that the choice between duty and family had always been false, that both were possible, that balance was achievable, and that institutions willing to adapt would always be stronger than institutions demanding conformity regardless of human cost.